Hi, thanks for coming out. I'm Rockie. Is anybody old enough, or I'm an ex-rocker. Does anybody besides the wife get that reference? Does anybody know who that is? Sorry? Thank you. At least somebody at an InfoSec conference gets that. He actually, I don't know, there's a weird story behind this. That was during the recording of some, of Stairway to Heaven on one of the live films that they did. And he said, does anyone remember laughter? And he immediately regretted that for the rest of his life. And so much so that as soon as he got off stage after that performance, he tried to ask the recording crew, can we take that out? Can we edit that out? And they were like, nope, can't do that. So, what we're here to talk about today is enterprise security architecture, right? And so, I've been in the InfoSec, community and industry for a long time. All of my certs have expired, including the ones that I've taught. I do a lot of stuff. We have B-Sides Cleveland coming up actually a week from yesterday. So this coming Saturday. Is anybody actually going to? One, two, I know you are. Organizer. So, on we go. So a quick history lesson. This SANS GSEC paper was published in 2002 about an approach to enterprise security architecture. There's throughout the past decade or so, a little over a decade, there's been a number of documents that have addressed some semblance of enterprise security architecture. A lot of people say that this Gartner paper from, what was that, 06? Yeah, from 06. Some people regard this as really kind of the inception of the true, I guess, structured enterprise security architecture. If you Google enterprise security architecture, there's a lot of things that come up, right? There's even a wiki page where you can kind of just, get the standard wiki definitions and whatnot. So there's a lot of information out there. In 07, this guy, Gunnar Peterson, if you don't know who he is, he's really interesting, and I would recommend looking him up. His blog is One Raindrop, the number one raindrop. But Gunnar is he's really smart, but B, in addition to kind of like his take on InfoSec and risk and things of that nature, he comes at it from almost a financial background, right? So risk is risk, and a lot of the financial people really understand risk very well. He's one of them. So this document was published in 06, 07, and as far as I'm concerned, still holds its weight, right? It's fighting in the appropriate weight class. So as we kind of get into the structure that I want to talk about in terms of enterprise security architecture, I'm going to really kind of be basing a lot of that on this, what he and his group did in 06, 07, because it completely still holds water. So, on the one hand, we've got all of these different references on enterprise security architecture. On the other side of the house, we've got all of these compliance frameworks. I assume that there's probably a few people in the audience that are working for or have clients that are in some type of industry that have regulatory compliance, whether it's medical or whether it's retail with PCI, et cetera. Compliance frameworks, whether or not it's regulatory, versus something like the NIST documents and things of that nature. There's lots of them out there, right? But we have all these references on enterprise security architecture, and we have all of these different types of either regulatory or some type of compliance framework. Why is this still happening? Right? This is informationisbeautiful.net. This was going around the Twitters for a few months ago. But it's a graphical representation of the largest data breaches from, this one is just from 2014 to present, right? And that was a few months ago, but I should probably update that. The actual site itself goes all the way to 2005, where you can see these kind of graphical representations. So that still continues to happen, and even more so when we take a look at information technology spend. Right, this is Gartner from 07 to 2014, just in trillions of dollars. So we're roughly in 2014 just hit $3.7 trillion that we spend globally in information technology, not just security, but information technology. And over here is the Verizon DVIR, right? 2008, to 2014. This jump from 2013 to 2014 went from approximately, 1,300 or so to 2221, right? These are the breaches, the actual verified, validated, organizations lost a shit ton of stuff, breaches. Well, what does that tell me? That tells me that we're completely spending our money in the wrong areas. We're investing in the wrong areas. If we're continuing to add, increase in trillions of dollars and our breaches come up, we're doing something completely wrong, right? So, why is this? In my opinion, there's two organizations, two types of organizations. Those that are treating their security programs on a project-by-project basis, right? So we need a new firewall, we need a new IPS, we need a new whatever, right? Shiny bright boxes. Or organizations, and this makes perfect sense from a business perspective, because they're treating their security programs from a compliance perspective. And why that makes sense is because if you're non-compliant to certain compliance frameworks, there's a business impact, there's a financial business impact called a fine, right? And so, leaders and executives of organizations that have regulatory compliance requirements are going to make sure that one of those priorities or the organizational priority is complying with that framework, right? And I'm hoping that most of you in here today, know the difference between security. What are the security nerds like me are always going to say what? If you're compliant, you're probably not secure. But if you're secure, you're also always going to be compliant. Right? So focusing on the security element of the organization's, your organization's programs, excuse me, is, and this isn't anything new. And this is why I'm happy to be on stage here, but I'm kind of like, why am I still talking about this, right? Enterprise security architecture has been around for over a decade. We know that following the compliance and checking the boxes off isn't making you secure. We have all that data. Target, raise your hand if you've gotten your letter from Target or Home Depot or Anthem or whatever, right? So the reality is that data security is inherently related to the business, okay? In such that, if your organization's business critical data gets stolen or destroyed or whatever, that's really where the financial impact hits. It's not that you're going to get popped with a whatever $50,000 fine because you this month aren't HIPAA compliant and something happened. It's when something does happen, then that's where all of our organizations need to focus on. So I just threw this in here because this really kind of makes me scratch my head. This is from Sean Mason's blog. A number of people have actually been looking at a lot of this recently, but it's the actual stock performance of all of the, a lot of the very large breached organizations versus the S&P 500 since the date of their actual breach report, or when they say, hey, guess what, sorry, we got breached. And for the most part, they're all doing really good against the S&P 500 performance, right? So if you have, at what point does that then become an enterprise, business strategy, getting breached so your stock continues to grow? I just thought that was kind of interesting. But The real problem here is that enterprises are complex, okay? And so, the other thing that the old nerds like me are always going to say is, look, if a system is complex, it's going to be less secure, right? But the reality is that enterprises just happen to be complex, right? There's no real way of getting around that. As businesses grow, the enterprise gets complex, and that's where architecture is necessary, right? Architecture is, from a security perspective, obviously, architecture is required to really kind of understand and manage that complexity in the enterprise. So when we take a look at what really kind of defines architecture, we can kind of boil it down to some really simple things that we see from our standard kind of architecture, like construction architecture and building architecture, right? What are the goals? What are we trying to build, right? What environment are we trying to build it in? And then, what is it going to take to actually build that and achieve our goals? And we can just kind of take that as a rough framework for architecture and utilize that kind of simplicity to manage the complexity of the enterprise. Then we're kind of heading down the right path, in my opinion. So what does it actually get us, right? So in managing complexity in an enterprise through an architecture framework, right? Usability, scalability, modularity, right? All these kind of fairly basic things that are also associated with what we kind of consider like construction architecture and building architecture, right? But I think most importantly, though, here from an InfoSec and risk perspective, is that it also gives us this operational risk management, right? So security and operational risk management is when organizations really kind of take hold and grasp that architecture framework and start thinking less about, right, either the new firewall or the HIPAA or PCI compliance. Now we're really starting to talk about, okay, let's delve into this whole, what makes us secure, right? What are the variables of this architecture that now we can kind of, not necessarily boilerplate, but we can define, right, in areas that then it's at the end of what we're trying to achieve is going to make our organizations that much more secure, right? So we have lots of breaches, we have compliance frameworks, there's a lot of history on architecture, so let's dive into this. This is the rough framework from the 2007 Architect paper by Gunnar Peterson and a few other people, right? So what's the first, and what I'm going to do here is really just kind of like start, I'm going to go through and define all these different things and with the understanding that architecturally we can utilize a framework like this, and it doesn't have to be this specific framework, I just happen to like that one, right? There's a number of them out there, Google it. But by utilizing this type of architecture framework, now we can really kind of, we have the tools to really begin to formulate a true security, right? We're trying to protect our business critical data, and this is how we do it. It's not, we don't do it through compliance. And again, the fact that I'm saying this in 2015, it just boggles my mind, but I guess I have to. So, right, stakeholder goals. I really refer to stakeholder goals as business systems analysis. Understanding the business, what are our goals? Working with the people who, it's their job to really kind of set the direction of the business. What is our business critical data? Where does it live? Where do we think it lives, right? Where do we think it lives? Are you sure you know where it lives, right? Mobility and all that stuff, these are all variables to those questions, right? But really working with the stakeholders to define what it is we're trying to protect. You can actually get into things like adversary analysis. And if you have the ability to do so, that really kind of gets you more honed in terms of what we're trying to protect, because that variable, like who else may find value in your data, is equally as important, right? And if we can kind of understand their capabilities, now we have the ability to kind of like really kind of model, based on our architecture framework, model these systems and controls that will effectively reduce the adversary's ROI. And if you can reduce somebody's ROI, if there's no profit in stealing your data, are they going to continue to do so? Probably not, right? So that's just kind of like an ancillary goal, hopefully. All right, so business systems analysis. Now we move into really the three kind of like main components. And yes, risk management is all about understanding value, right? Understanding value, what's the asset value, understanding threat landscape, right? And understanding really what's the impact to an organization if something bad happens, right? What's the likelihood and probability of that actually happening? And then what's the financial impact? Financial impact, right? That's quantitative. And that's really key too, right? Qualitative, quantitative, there's always going to be, that's a religious argument when we're talking about risk analysis. But, hey, you know something? The people that run your business, they like to speak in terms of dollars. So if we can communicate our message, that also associates that dollar value, that they have something that really kind of, our job in information security really is to ensure that the people who are making the business decisions, right, they don't have to be technical experts. But we can't just show up with a 500-page vulnerability report and be like, we're fucked. We need more money. That doesn't work. There has to be focused, business level, tangible output in order for the business to really kind of understand what we're trying to communicate in such a way that they can make the appropriate investment, whatever that might be, right? That's in my opinion, that's our job. Right? So policy and standards. Now policy and standards, guess what? A lot of that is compliance. If you haven't figured it out, I'm not a big fan of compliance. However, we have to have it. We have it. Maybe we don't have to have it, but we do have it, right? And we have auditors, and so all this stuff is part of a normal enterprise life. That also includes internal policies and standards, right? And that's also very, very critical, well, especially when we talk about governance within an organization, right? But the policy and standards really, really helps us when we then start getting into the processes of things like software development lifecycle, threat management, and things of that nature. All right, so policy and standards. And then the third main component of the enterprise security architecture is the architecture itself, right? This is the actual, okay, we're going to design our networks and systems in such a way, X, Y, Z, and get the really smart people to kind of analyze what are our options on the market, things of that nature. So when we take a look at all three of these components within the enterprise security architecture, they are all made up now of process, defense in depth, right? Now this is our standard defense in depth that I'm sure most everybody in here understands. The data level security, application level security, endpoint security, network security. Those are the standard controls that most people, I'm sure, are used to kind of talking about, right? But then also, here's something over here that is a critical component of being able for us, information security and risk, being able to communicate the message to the business, right? Metrics, right? Raise your hand. Everybody raise your hand. Just do it. Awesome. All right, good. I wasn't sure what room I was in, right? Yes. A lot of people are just like, hey, raise your hand if you're in the medical industry, and nobody raises their hand. It's just whatever. So anyway, right? Metrics. Raise your hand if you're doing a really good job with metrics. Okay. Nobody, right? That's not out of the ordinary, okay? Most organizations are horrible at this. And the reality is that that's really probably one of the most important variables in communicating our message, right? Vulnerability management, okay? Do you guys have, I'm not going to ask the question. Here's a great metric in vulnerability management. Time to remediation, okay? So if we have the intelligence that a new vulnerability that affects something in our organization, in our enterprise, that comes out at day X, call it, right? And then we have the tools from intelligence, scanning, patching, and accountability, right? Handing it off to the right teams through the enterprise ticketing systems and things like that. If we can show that through that process, in our vulnerability management process, that it, on average, takes us 4 days to time to remediation for a vulnerability that, depending on the severity, affects our organization, that's something that the business is going to listen to, right? If that metric is 45 days, that's something that we can now, when we communicate that, take advantage of. That's unacceptable, or we think that's unacceptable. Business, do you agree? Yes, we agree that that's unacceptable. Awesome. Now we can have money. Things like that, right? So, anyway, metrics, huge component of all this. So, as we get into the process section, right, not every organization, I'm going to start with the software development lifecycle, not every organization develops software. That's fine. Even if you're not in that kind of vertical or your business doesn't participate in a lot of that, the majority of organizations still have people that are developing stuff, right? Whether it's scripts or anything like that. So a lot of this kind of applies even in organizations that aren't specifically developing software, right? And what I would definitely, if you are in an organization that does develop software, by all means, please look at this. That is the Application Security Verification Standard 2014. Does anybody know what OWASP Top 10 and whatever all that stuff is? Okay, who develops actual, software development vertical? Anybody actually developing software? Okay, so I'll be brief, right? The OWASP Top 10 or whatever 20, I forget, 10. It's a really complex document, and it's virtually unusable. I guess that's a good word. But it's very, it's a thick read. Some other people in OWASP decided that was a little too complex and came out with this, the Application Security Verification, the ASVS. The 2014 version was released, I believe, in November, and I saw a presentation by Bill Senf on this at B-Sides Columbus in January, and I was like, oh, that's awesome. So, as a reference, if anybody does, has a SDLC program within the business, by all means, please take a look at that document. It's fantastic. Okay, identity management. This is, a lot of the stuff, again, this is pretty self-explanatory, right? Identity management. Who can do what, right? So all of this stuff, when we take a look at, architecturally and strategically, right, principle of least privilege, all that jazz, right, the stuff that we've been taught over the years. All this falls into identity management, right, including all the controls and systems that support that, including provisioning, multi-factor authentication, etc. All of this, from an identity management perspective, needs to be tied into, right, very heavily into policy and standards, right? We have to have those kind of standards, identity management standards, in terms of who can access what, in order to successfully have the processes that will then enforce all this stuff from an architecture perspective. Right, so to the degree, at a very, let's call it advanced level, making sure that people like, let's say in HR, aren't able to, over the intranets, access any of the financial systems, things of that nature, right? So there's a wide, variety of things that fall under identity management. So moving into vulnerability management, okay? I'm a big vulnerability management guy. I will not lie. And so when I work with clients and within my own organization, I like to look at vulnerability management and break it down into two primary areas. One is intelligence and one is scanning, okay? So intelligence really kind of then above and beyond your standard, oh, it's Patch Tuesday, I got an email from Microsoft telling me that there are patches. Intelligence is really, things like vulnerability subscription services where we're defining our assets that we have and then popping those into these systems that say, oh, anytime a vulnerability affects these systems that are in your environment, you need to know about that, things of that nature. Third-party websites like the Internet Storm Center, they do a great job, post Patch Tuesday, the Adobe vulnerabilities, things of that nature to really kind of, Microsoft may say that this is only an important, vulnerability, but in reality it affects, Internet Explorer at this level, and therefore it's really a critical patch instead of what Microsoft says. But all of this stuff is from a vulnerability management perspective, again tied into policy and standards. Raise your hand again. Yay! Vulnerability management standards, right? Do we have any vulnerability management? So I'm going to, forgive me, I'm going to put you on a spot a little bit. What do you do? How is it, how are you defining vulnerability management? Are there different variables that kind of go into that in your organization? Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. All those variables are great, right? When we take a look at vulnerability announcements that come in, we pretty much look at three variables, right? Is it remote? Is that exploit remotely executable? Does it escalate privileges? And is it in the wild? Right? So if all three of those are true, then we may end up escalating that by a change control to an immediate patch, right? As opposed to whatever our standard kind of, our standard patching time frame normally is. But yeah, those are all great. And things like, as you get into things like scanning, right? Are we scanning our systems with authenticated credentials, or are they unauthenticated, scans, internal, external, all that stuff? Great stuff. So, threat management. This is. I think this is where a lot of the fun happens, right? Threat management in terms of incident response, digital forensics, the monitoring teams, all that stuff. And so, really, threat management to me, has to be treated completely differently from vulnerability management, because this is where we start talking about actor, right? That actor has to be whatever that actor may be, whether it's an insider or whatever. But this is where we begin thinking about things in terms of actor and hence threat, and the associated kind of processes around the threat management itself. So here's a side note when talking about threat management is that threat modeling is awesome. This little definition down here was from Bruce Potter, who was here this weekend. But his DerbyCon 2014 talk talks about threat modeling in terms of this, right? Actor does action to asset, resulting in outcome because of motivation. That's an awesome way to kind of define threat modeling, right? So when we really talk about threat modeling, right, the variables like what's the objective, right? Being able to answer those types of questions, clearly there needs to be that understanding of the business critical data, et cetera, right? So, understanding, are there preventative things from a reconnaissance perspective? Are there ways to prevent the exploitation? Are there ways to prevent the lateral movement? the whole drink, kill chain phrase is really about understanding if an actor can get into the systems, let's say system A, and then from system A bounce to B and C and D and E somehow, right? So there are maybe vulnerabilities or just privilege escalation or whatever, and after E, they're able to get to business critical data. Well, that A, B, C, D, and E path, if we can maybe disrupt one of those, that might not happen, right? So threat modeling, right? And it's really, really important for organizations, in my opinion, to kind of go through that. If you have a third-party penetration testing, organization that comes in and basically, pwns you or whatever, the value for something like that, and make sure that they provide you this information, is that threat model. Right? So now you have the opportunity to take a look at that. This is how we broke into your domain controller. It's not just that we broke into the domain controller and stole all your stuff. This is how we did it. We're social engineered somebody here or did blah, blah, blah. But that threat model now really gives the organization, from a defensive perspective, the ability to say, oh, that third step that they did before they got to the domain controller and knock that thing down, well, that's an easy fix. So if we can pull that one out, that chain is now broken. Right? Threat modeling, good stuff. Okay, so now we move into our defense in depth, right? And this is really where most people are very comfortable with, right? And it's very standard stuff. Starting with data security, the security of the data really is, when we talk about the systems that support that, right, this is database stuff for the most part. And so all that really, how we are protecting the data really kind of is associated with the software development life cycle, which obviously is coming out of, the risk assessment and policy and standards. But data security, securing the data. Are we encrypting it at rest, right? Are we encrypting it over the wire, et cetera? Are we making sure that the, back-end systems are not publicly available? Shodan, anybody, right? Have you ever just kind of like searched Shodan for publicly available SQL servers? There's a lot of them out there. It's pretty silly. And so as we move into, kind of like down our defense in depth, set of variables here, application security, right? So now we're talking about not just the protection of the back-end data, but now application security, right? Role-based access controls, all the good stuff. And depending on the size of the organization, right? Application scanning and fuzzing really are important variables to this. Let's face the facts from a development and application perspective, okay? The dev teams are really good at what they do, develop code, right? And security typically, in most organizations, is the afterthought, right? So a lot of organizations probably can't afford to either train their dev people into, there was a great conversation, I think it was yesterday, about how can you kind of get some of these ancillary non-security parts of the organization interested in security, right? Being able to talk their language and offer, let's say the security group offers to pay for some secure coding training for those groups, things like that. It's going to depend on the size of the organization, whether or not that's even feasible. But, we're talking about, again, defense in depth. And here are some really good, some good layers on the application side. So what? Endpoint security, right? Everybody knows endpoint security, our AVs, et cetera. I'll just throw this in, right? AV is almost a non-control at this point, right, Mr. Hogan? And even to a degree, some of the things that Adam was talking about earlier today, in his talk from a heuristics perspective, right? Really fall and probably are becoming much more important from an endpoint protection perspective today than ever before, right? But we all know this stuff. DLP is a tough one. I completely admit that, right? Data loss prevention systems can be ridiculously complex and just a bear to manage. So, obviously all organizations are going to be different, but when you're evaluating certain controls that may fall into this, this endpoint security, that may fall under endpoint security, make sure you're doing some good due diligence around DLP, because if you end up getting sold a DLP system that takes 4 people to 4 full-time employees to run and all that stuff, are you really going to get the value out of that, of what you think you're buying, right? It's a tough one. I think it's a really critical control if you can do it right. I haven't seen it done right well often at all. Does anybody have any other opinions about that? I mean, does anybody know or have seen, experienced, built, whatever, a good, strong DLP system? You're shaking, you're nodding your head, yes? Speak to me. Speak to me. Tell me about it. Compliance. Sure. That can't be good. Right. Awesome. Yeah, it's great. How many people are managing it? And I guess roughly yeah. Okay. Yep. Sure. That's great. Thanks. 6 people. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and if the organization is large enough that you can invest in those systems and the supporting people and all that, awesome. There you go. Yeah, that's pretty large. But yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, it can be done well, but it's not going to be cheap. Sure, there's open DLP and some of those other things, but it's just, that's one of those things. DLP is one of those things. From there. Network security, right? Standard stuff. Firewalls, DMZs, etc. I don't think I'm not really going to focus and focus a lot of time onto this stuff, because when we really get down to it, right, this, like I said it before, defense and dev stuff, we all really kind of get all those types of controls, right? So now let's get into metrics, right? And metrics, again, from my experience in working with organizations as well as my own organization, that's not a lot of people out there doing it right. And I'm not saying that I have this silver bullet. No, I mean, the goal is, again, in my opinion, the goal from a metrics perspective, our role is to, from an information security and risk perspective, be able to communicate our kind of technical findings and things like that up to the business so that they don't have to be the technical experts, right? And we do this primarily through metrics, right? So, obviously, measurements of overall assets is a key element of the metrics. Right? The usual suspects, right? Vulnerabilities, threats, what are the countermeasures, things of that nature from a risk perspective. And again, there is the religious argument as to how that communication gets delivered. Is it via qualitative, like high, medium, low type analysis, or quantitative? And my preference, because we are working with the business people who like to talk in terms of dollars, I like quantitative. That's a personal preference, and again, it's a religious argument. There's lots of people on both sides of that argument. Enterprise reporting, right? So, key risk indicators, performance indicators. A lot of those, a lot of these buzzwords are starting to really kind of make it out of the core, I would say, metric industry. Maybe not industry, but we're seeing a lot more of the KPIs and KRIs in a lot of things are more geared towards educating the users and business and even HR and things of that nature. Organizations that are bonusing their people on KPIs, etc. But these metrics really, again, rolling up things that at an enterprise architecture level, at an enterprise level, right? These are a lot of the variables that the business people are going to want to know about and are comfortable speaking to. So if we have the ability to communicate in these terms to the business people, right? That's going to make our lives a lot easier, and as a result, making our business critical data that much more secure. And then finally, domain reporting. And this, if you can break down the organization, the enterprise into whatever little subdomains you have, right? Each of those domains, whether it's authentication or identity or whatever, there's all sorts of great metrics that can come in, right? Daily inbound email, malware, okay. But how much of that inbound malware that is kind of flagged as maybe malware? Has anybody, do you have stats on, let's say, people who are now forwarding that back out to, let's say, their personal or other accounts, right? Things of that nature, metrics like that. Denying access to business critical systems and folders. I can tell you from a penetration testing perspective, when we're doing red teaming and other types of engagements like that, there's no reason that we, as the simulated adversary, should be allowed to log into multiple servers within a very small time frame, right? But we can. And so things like that, if an adversary has breached the organization's systems and, at some point in the architecture, there's there's a playbook, right? There's a playbook that, they're going to try to move laterally, and that's going to be utilizing that particular account that, that is now breached, and can we log into other servers and things of that nature. All that stuff, we can have, there are ways to build metrics around. And again, the metrics, this is really where we want to be focusing in on. And metrics give us the best chance of being able to communicate that up to the business, hands down. So, the enterprise security architecture, right? We still have auditors. The nice part about all this is that we can map all of that, right? So, the vulnerability management process or the threat management process or our defense in depth on the network or endpoint side, we can map all of that into any of our compliance frameworks, whether it's a regulatory compliance framework or whether it's a best practice framework like NIST and things of that nature. And did I just do that? I probably did. Sorry. I hit the wrong button. Come on. I have 2 more slides. All right, well, we'll figure it out. Yes, no, maybe? All right. Enterprise security for the win as we continue to blip in and out of this. I don't know what's going on. So I'll just kind of, here's what we get out of building an enterprise security architecture, right? Focusing on the key areas of concern for the business. Remember the stakeholders, right? We have to have those conversations. Business systems analysis, understanding the goals, what we're trying to build, how, in what environment we're trying to build it in, and all of that jazz. Enabling the disparate groups within the enterprise organization to understand their role. We get metrics, which obviously I've been harping about up here, and how important that is. Encouraging repeatable processes, right? But really, and again, I am repeating myself, but right, by doing it this way and embracing, the processes, the defense depth, and building metrics and building systems that are going to be able to help us deliver these types of metrics. This is how, the most important thing here that I want to stress is this is how we communicate to the business, right? So not only by embracing the architecture itself, not only is that giving us a framework for securing the business critical data in such a way that isn't necessarily dependent upon the new firewall or the new IPS, as well as not even taking into consideration the compliance aspect of it, right? Because when we build an architecture like this, and again, it doesn't have to be this specific framework, but something similar, right? When we build it like this, when you're secure, you're also going to be compliant. And we can map it up to whatever compliance frameworks you want. That's great. But yeah, at the end of the day, this is how we communicate to the business. And that's where I've seen a lot of organizations, whether it's the IS, information security, or the IT teams, fail in really kind of getting the organization, the business part of the organization, to understand the importance of investing in A, B, or C. And we can provide all of that through the architecture, especially our metrics. So, all right, that's pretty much all I got here. So, with that, here's some references. If you want to take a picture, what are you laughing at? Yeah, that's the lens. Yeah, that just so everybody actually got that first attempt at a joke. Yeah, there's the song remains the same link. Okay, so cool. Questions, comments, make me think. Yes, sir. Isn't that nice? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Sure. Hey, that happens. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Oh, absolutely. Thanks. Can I ask, and absolutely don't have to be specific, but are you in an organization, is your organization and the associated business critical data maybe more along the lines of like intellectual property and things of that nature, or are we talking, let's say, things like credit card numbers, blah, blah, blah? Finance? Okay, perfect, yeah. Finance is a great, when the great thing about the adversary targeting the finance industry is that there doesn't have to be a middleman, right? Money. You know, it's not like I'm stealing intellectual property and then I have to find somebody who wants to buy it and whatnot. But yeah, no, absolutely. And that's, I would say that, I would say that manufacturing, in my experience, I've seen the most high-level support, business-level support for the information security teams and risk and all that stuff in finance as well as manufacturing. But the manufacturing side of the house where that really has like heavy intellectual property, right? That's where the people really get it. Yeah. Anything else? Questions? Yes? Cool. That happens. I get it. You know. Cool. Anything else? Anybody? I appreciate, and you know, I do want to say that I apologize if a lot of this is maybe, you know, material that you've already seen, but I really think that even though a lot of this stuff from an architecture perspective is not new, nobody's doing it. Or not a lot of people are doing it, you know, it's not the area of focus. So I think, like, you know, to a degree, I think we really need to pound these types of messages in and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. Because the results are, you know, we have all these giant breaches and they're HIPAA compliant or they're PCI compliant or they have the latest Palo Alto or whatever, and it's just wrong. But so, off of my pedestal. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it.